Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, in this video, what we're first going to do is we're going to talk about ETH Bitcoin. So we're going to talk about the valuation of Ethereum with respect to Bitcoin. If you have been in the cryptoverse long enough, you know, or you should know, that this valuation for Ethereum is the only one that actually matters. The USD valuation is largely irrelevant once you value your portfolio in Satoshis. All right. So we're going to start with ETH Bitcoin, which is the one that makes more sense to look at. In fact, I think everyone would probably be better off if they only ever looked at this chart for ETH and not the ETH USD chart. Then we're going to go over to ETH USD. Okay. Now, before we get started, I will say that my views on ETH Bitcoin have been very correct for the last few years, but my views on ETH USD have not been. I've always contended that ETH USD would go up if Bitcoin went up, but I also have obviously called for Ethereum to go home, which it never did. And so some things I get right, some things I get wrong. If you value your portfolio in sats, then it doesn't matter if your USD predictions come true, right? Because with ETH Bitcoin putting in new lows today, doesn't really matter if ETH USD hasn't gone to where I thought it was going to go. Now, you could, of course, argue that is coping, and I'm not going to disagree with you because to a large extent, you are in fact correct. But the other way to think about it is that if you were just staying Bitcoin heavy, then all the upside that ETH has had, Bitcoin has had, and more since the merge occurred. So let's go ahead and jump into ETH Bitcoin because I'm starting to see people capitulate, okay? And I'm not saying that, I can't speak into any individual situation, right? But I do believe that ETH Bitcoin is getting very close to a bottom. And let's first talk about that. So the bullish view for ETH Bitcoin is what I'm about to explain to you now. In the short term, it could still be bearish. I would say that, and this is my own opinion, I think that ETH will bottom against Bitcoin within the next 2 months. So I would say my base case is to bottom before the end of the year, but I could envision a scenario where it doesn't bottom until, say, mid-January of 2025. And of course, there are scenarios where it takes longer than that to bottom, and I'll mention those, but I don't really think they're the most likely outcome. But we'll cover them just so you are aware. So the first thing to remember with ETH Bitcoin is this pattern has been a sort of a perfectly repeatable pattern. And we've seen it 2 cycles in a row. And because I saw it play out 2 cycles in a row, this cycle, I was very deterministic, which I probably shouldn't have been, but it worked. This one worked out, right? This deterministic prediction actually worked out. Not all of them do. And really, you shouldn't ever be deterministic about the markets. But the idea is that when you're in the bull market, ETH Bitcoin sets some form of a high. And it does it early on in the bull market. It does it before ETH USD hits a high, normally. That's not always true, but normally that's essentially what happens is that, you hit a high and then ETH USD hits a high shortly thereafter, and then the market goes down. So look at 2016. You will see the ETH Bitcoin had a high in April, and then it had a lower high here in June. My laptop's a little laggy right now, so I think laptops, I guess, have been bleeding against Bitcoin, so I haven't gotten a new one. But I really should get a new one. By the way, don't ever let anyone tell you you need a fancy setup to start doing YouTube videos. I'm literally just using a MacBook Pro, internal mic, and internal video. That's all I have set up here. And I have a monitor as well. But ETH Bitcoin sets a high and then sets a lower high. And in between those two peaks, there's a low that is set. You can see a low is set in April 2016, and then a low is set in November 2017, and then a low was set in June of 2022. That low becomes important later on in the cycle, but it doesn't become important immediately because no one actually knows exactly where that first low is going to be. But then the market rallies off of that low, and then it makes people call for the flippening, right? Where the valuation of ETH, the market cap of ETH, flips Bitcoin. And I can't necessarily give people a hard time about that call because there was once upon a time that I also thought that it was possible. Because in 2017, ETH actually got really close to flipping Bitcoin. Like it really wasn't that far away. It was in this first peak in 2017. But ever since then, I've really sort of calmed down those views. I don't really think Ethereum has a chance of flipping Bitcoin. At least if it does, I don't think it'll happen anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that the valuation can't go up, right? I mean, if Bitcoin, it's already gone to 93K. If ETH Bitcoin were to go back to say 0.07, I mean, that would be a great rally by ETH USD. So I would implore people to not view the success of Ethereum as based on whether it can flip Bitcoin, because the reality is that you will likely be disappointed if you go into it thinking that that's what's going to happen. If you go into it thinking that ETH is potentially converging to whatever its fair value is, then I think you're going to be left with a little bit more realistic expectations that have a chance of being met, right? So you have two peaks. Even this cycle, we got two peaks. We got one in November, and then we got one in September of 2022 going into the merge. Now, I sold my ETH for Bitcoin before this drop right here, right? So I made, I made a post about it, obviously, on ITC Premium. I sold before the drop. I did sell a little bit more during the drop, and then I sold the final batch sort of up here around the merge. So my best sell was probably right around 0.08, 0.084, something like that. My main sell was at 0.075, and then there was another sell, I believe, somewhere over here as it was dropping, because I'm like, all right, I converted a lot right here, and then I was like, all right, it is coming true, so I converted more, and then I got my face ripped off, and then I converted more, and I got made fun of, relentlessly, and then here we are, and now no one cares because ETH is at 0.035 against Bitcoin, right? It doesn't matter if it was converted at 0.06 or 0.07 or 0.08, right? The reality is that whether you converted it at any of those valuations, you're doing very well today, right? And so what I was able to accomplish is by converting my ETH to Bitcoin at 0.075 on average, right, on average, then by converting it back in Q4 2024, I'm able to double up my Ethereum by doing nothing more than sitting in Bitcoin. Nothing more. I did not have to predict the price of Bitcoin USD or ETH USD, and you guys know I don't really have a great track record of predicting exactly where those things are going to go. It's really hard to predict where the market's going to go. I think the best strategy is to just DCA and forget about it and go live your life. That's what I think the best strategy is, because no one can predict exactly where the market's going to go. So in this case, with ETH Bitcoin, why could it bottom out soon? Okay, why could it? Well, the first thing I will say is that there were two prior years where ETH Bitcoin broke below support, 2016 and 2019. Now, in 2016, it bottomed in December, and it also sort of had a fake out halfway through the year, kind of like we did over here. See this fake out below the lows? Similar to this one. This fake out occurred in May. This fake out occurred over here in June. And then ETH Bitcoin rallied back up, and then ultimately it collapsed to these lows. Do you see that? So when I look at that chart, it looks like, but looks can be deceiving. It looks like there's a chance that ETH Bitcoin bottoms in December, because it bottomed over here in December 2016 following a very similar pattern. And so the argument is, well, there's a chance that it just simply bottoms in December of 2024, right? I mean, maybe it doesn't actually have to be any more complicated than that, right? It's just December 2016, December 2024. And then in a year, everyone's going to be wondering why they squabbled about whether they bought ETH Bitcoin or where they converted their, or got some ETH at 0.035 or 0.032 or 0.038 or 0.03, right? It's not going to matter more than likely, because I'm guessing it's going to be higher. Now, I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong about that, like always, I will come out and raise my hand and be like, all right, I got it wrong. But I have been on the right side of the ETH Bitcoin trade for 2.5 years. And so I do carry, I feel like, some level of confidence, but just because I was right about one thing does not mean I'll be right about the next thing related to this ratio. So I look at this and I think, all right, well, just from a cyclical point of view, forget monetary policy for a minute, right? From a cyclical point of view, it looks like, why not? Like, why not have it just bottom out between now and the end of the year, as everyone finally capitulates, right? Because Bitcoin's going parabolic. But this is the exact move I spent 2.5 years trying to warn people about. And now that people are capitulating to Bitcoin, it's fueling the rally for Bitcoin. And as someone who has been a Bitcoin maxi hat, had my Bitcoin maxi hat on for 3 years, I'm happy with that, right? Because my portfolio is mainly just Bitcoin, and it has been for 3 years, because I had my maxi hat on. I didn't know where Bitcoin USD was going to go. I mean, it took me a couple of months into 2022 to recognize it was a bear market, but I didn't know for sure. And so it makes sense to hold Bitcoin through the downturns, through the upturns. Obviously, if you can sell based on the risk levels, that also helps out. But if you don't know, and you just want to sort of hold on for the long haul, then there's nothing wrong with that strategy of just sticking with the king until Bitcoin dominance is higher. And that's exactly what I did. So today, for every critic out there who will dunk on my ETH USD valuation, and I'll dunk on myself too. Remember, most of them were also very bullish on ETH Bitcoin. And so, yes, congratulations that you were right about ETH USD and I was wrong, but why are you celebrating holding on to ETH when it's now down, 60% against Bitcoin, right? I mean, yes, I was wrong about ETH USD, but you could have held on to a lower risk asset and not be 60% down against that lower risk asset by holding on to Ethereum. So that was the point. And my biggest trouble with communicating with my audience is that, in my mind, I think in terms of Satoshis. I don't think in terms of US dollars, right? When I go buy something, let's say I go buy anything. I don't know. Let's just go say I buy a laptop, right? Which I probably should do soon. And it's, I don't know, $1,000 or $2,000, right? I might look at that and say, do I think of that in terms of, oh crap, I'm spending $2,000? Or do I think about it in terms of like, that's a fraction of a Bitcoin, right? Or that's, that's 60% of ETH, of one ETH. That's what I think about, right? I think about, what is the opportunity cost? With Bitcoin, if you're talking about $2,000, that's, like what, 2 to 3% or something like that. That's what I think. That's what my mind is wired for at this point, because I've been in the Cryptoverse so long that I think about things in terms of their Bitcoin valuations, not just altcoins, not just ETH, but in life. I just think about, like, if I'm going to go buy a car and the car costs $40,000 or something, or $30,000, I'm like, well, hell, that's 1/3 of a Bitcoin, So if you can wire your brain to think about it like that, then the Cryptoverse actually becomes a lot easier. But if you think about it in terms of US dollars, then my content will probably drive you up the wall, because I will dunk on assets like ETH for 2.5 years during a Bitcoin dominance uptrend. And you're probably sitting there wanting to pull your hair out because you're like, what right does he have to dunk on ETH when ETH USD has just been trending up, right? It's been trending up since 2022. So why is Ben over here dunking on ETH? His views on ETH USD have been wrong. So he needs to take his ego down a notch. And I am, right? I'm the market has humbled me with the USD valuation. But my strategy has always been to value my portfolio in terms of sats, not US dollars. So it is true, I've been wrong about this, right? I did think it would come back down here before going back up. I did. And I will hold my hand up high. I will admit I was wrong. I have found that, when stuff like this happens and I do admit I was wrong, I usually have to say it several times because not everyone watches every video. And if you're watching this video, there's a good chance that half the people that were watching this video didn't make it until this point in the video. So for me, I recognize that my views on ETH USD could have been better. But by sticking with Bitcoin, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Up until recently, I have started to hedge. So let's talk about that. So in 2016, ETH Bitcoin bottomed. When did it bottom? Like, when specifically did it bottom? Because December, you're talking about a whole month. When in December did it actually bottom? Well, you can see that it bottomed near the end of it, right? I mean, it was actually the week of December 26th. The week of January 2nd, the low was already in. So it was late December back then. There's no guarantee it does the same exact thing. So let's look at the other time that it bottomed. Why did ETH Bitcoin bottom in September of 2019? Why did it bottom then? My thought process on it is that is when the Fed ended quantitative tightening and began quantitative easing. So when you look at this blue line here, this is the balance sheet by the Fed, you will notice that precisely where they went from precisely where the Fed went from QT over here and transitioning to QE over here, that is where ETH Bitcoin bottomed. So during QT, ETH Bitcoin went down, and then during QE, ETH Bitcoin went up. So a lot of people, have given me a hard time for the last few years about ETH because they're like, well, ETH outperforms Bitcoin in a bull market. But what they got wrong was that ETH outperforms Bitcoin in the bull market that they saw in 2021. But had they been around crypto in 2019, they would have known that it only outperforms Bitcoin in a QE bull market, not in a QT bull market. In a QT bull market, in a quantitative tightening environment with high rates, Bitcoin outperforms. So, just like last cycle, during quantitative tightening, ETH Bitcoin has gone down. There's been a lot of great developments for Ethereum. There's been the transition to proof of stake. There has been, obviously the deflationary aspect has played a role. There's been all sorts of stuff that Ethereum could argue, even the ETF, right? But every single one of those narratives did not stop the bleed. And so what's happening is it's making a lot of people give up. They're giving up because they're like, well, nothing changed the trend. So why should they continue to hold ETH? Because nothing that the sort of everyone told them that would change it and lead to the flipping, none of it came true. And here they are sitting here, 2 years after the merge, and ETH Bitcoin is down essentially 60%. Those things that they say were not necessarily bad, right? We don't know exactly what will come of all that. My argument back then, that was always misconstrued by the critics, I was not against ETH. None of the developments I was dunking on. It was nothing more than monetary policy, right? I just said, like, guys, it has nothing to do with ETH. It has nothing to do with the proof of stake. The reality is proof of work is more battle tested. Bitcoin has been around longer. So when you're going into periods of higher economic uncertainty with high rates and quantitative tightening, people are going to flee to the lower risk asset. And that means going away from ETH and to Bitcoin. So that was the transition from QT to QE. That marked the low. So I'm wondering, will the Fed pivot from QT to QE at the December meeting? I don't know. My base case is that ETH Bitcoin either bottoms before the end of the year or mid-January at the latest. But if the Fed doesn't pivot to QT or to QE at the next meeting, then the meeting after that isn't until January. Right? It's not until January. So, it could go later than my prediction, right? My prediction about that could in fact be wrong if they don't transition to QE before then. But for now, my base case is that it bottoms in Q4 of this year or the second week, the first half of January 2025 at the latest. If I'm wrong about that, if it keeps going down, it's probably because they haven't pivoted to QE. That would be my guess, right? So if we're sitting here in March of 2025 and ETH Bitcoin is still dropping, then either one of two things. One, option A is we're still in QT. Option B is that it's a relic. And that the relics argument is not my base case. It's not. But with crypto, you always have to be willing to change your views when proven wrong. My base case is that ETH Bitcoin will bottom within the next 2 months. But like anything, like everything, I get a lot of things wrong. And so if I'm wrong about that, I will have to sort of reassess. But for now, I think that ETH Bitcoin will likely bottom within the next couple of months. And it would fit in with sort of the prior two cycles, especially if the pivot to QE occurs. I guess the biggest elephant in the room is what's going to make them go to QE? And what incentive do they have to go to QE? Because all we've really seen for the last several years at this point is the stock market keeps going to new highs. Bitcoin keeps going to new highs, right? And the unemployment rate is still relatively low, right? It's still at 4.1%. Initial claims came in today at 216,000, I believe. I don't think you're facing a recession until initial claims are at 300,000 plus. So when you look at this sort of stuff, it makes sense to be somewhat flexible to sort of saying, well, how's the data going to come in? So by saying I think QE starts within the next couple of months means that I must be saying that the labor market is going to give us a surprise within the next couple of months. Because if it doesn't give us a surprise within the next couple of months, then what reason would the Fed have to go from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing? One interesting thing about this timing, if you look here at this blue line and you look at where it is right now, it's about to reach the level that it hit right here in July 2020. There was a massive printing going on. And then there was sort of a pullback on the Fed. The balance sheet went down for a little bit, and then it went up. This entire slow grind up has now been completely taken away. So I wonder is as the balance sheet sort of falls back into this level, will it cause some uncertainty in the markets? Is it forecasting some further labor market weakness or not? Because if there is no labor market weakness, then there's probably no QE. And if there's no QE, then you're still likely just better off sticking with Bitcoin. So for me, previously I was essentially Bitcoin only. That's not entirely true. I did have a tiny bit of other crypto, mostly just ETH, but it was like 1% or less. It was just something I had. It was like a purchase I made, it was $200 back in 2019 or $100 or something. So here, I look at the chart and I'm like, well, I think it's probably going to bottom within the next couple of months. But in order for it to bottom, there needs to be a reason for the Fed to pivot to QE. I don't know what that reason is going to be. This is my thoughts. These are my thoughts on ETH Bitcoin. So, what happened with ETH USD, right? I have been wrong about it, and there's always this sort of like this thinking in the cryptoverse of like, well, when is he going to admit he's wrong? When are they going to admit they're wrong? Everyone gets things wrong. If you find someone that gets everything right, don't tell anyone. Keep that information to yourself. You can message me about it. Let me know who it is, because I don't mind following that person. But everyone gets things wrong. And that is sort of the reality that we all must face. No one has a crystal ball. It might look like I knew what was going to happen with ETH Bitcoin, and I was right about it. But I was wrong about ETH USD. And by wrong, I mean, it's not that I didn't think it could go up. I always contended that it would go up if Bitcoin would go up. I just thought, I really did think, I'm trying to figure out where I went wrong, but I really did think that it would go home. I did, because that's what it did. In 2019 or 2016, ETH USD went home. In 2019, when ETH Bitcoin broke down, ETH USD went home. So I thought that was going to happen. But normally in November of the year that ETH Bitcoin breaks down, ETH USD also breaks down in November, like it did right there, like it did right there. But this time it broke up. So clearly, my view of ETH going home has not panned out. It hasn't. It has been wrong. Now, you could argue that I just simply need to refit the curve, but it's hard because, when ETH Bitcoin has broken down in the past, it led to sort of these 70% corrections by ETH USD. And so, that was sort of my base case going into all this, was that it would eventually go home. So, of course, now because it hasn't gone home, I am getting dunked on, and it's okay. Like, I recognize that is something I have to accept. If I'm gonna be willing to put out bold predictions and celebrate when I'm right, like ETH Bitcoin, I have to be willing to acknowledge when I'm wrong. And I have been wrong about this. Again, my counterpoint is that if you just stuck with Bitcoin, it doesn't matter if you're wrong about this. But because the critics don't stick with Bitcoin, they stick with just basically a portfolio of alts, they have to criticize me anytime ETH USD goes up, because it's doing basically the opposite of what I said. Like, I thought it was going to go down at this point, and it's not. It has not. So I was wrong. So, I'm trying to force myself to look at it in a different way, to sort of figure out, like, what am I missing? And of course, also, I mean, it doesn't sort of elude me the idea that it could still happen, but at this point, I'm not as actively betting against it anymore, or betting for it. Right now, I'm actively betting against it. I'm starting to, right? I've started to hedge. The reason I've started to hedge with some ETH, just a few percent, is because ETH Bitcoin has come to my target range of 0.03 to 0.04. And because Bitcoin dominance has hit that 60% milestone. That's the reason I've started to hedge. So I am already actively betting against, or hedging against, ETH not going home. As much as I want it to, as much as it makes sense to me, the markets don't have to make sense. ETH Bitcoin makes a lot of sense. To me, this is what it was always going to do. ETH USD, it always seemed like that it needed one more drop, right? One more drop. And this first drop was easily predictable. The second drop I also thought was going to happen. And we went through it, right? We went through it every single month. We said, look, guys, it's following 2016. It's getting your April and your August and your December drops. April, August, December. And so I was like, look, guys, April, August, December. It's going to take us home, and then we'll celebrate. We'll pop the champagne, and we'll celebrate Ethereum coming home. We'll get the welcome party, and everything will be right with the world. And then ETH went up, right? And honestly, it's funny because it went up shortly after I said I was converting some ETH to Bitcoin, or sorry, some Bitcoin to ETH, right? It went up shortly after that. So to some degree, again, people are laughing, but I'm also, not that I don't consider myself at all ability, to have any ability to move the market, but it's also laughing because I'm also contributing at least my tiny, tiny amount to this move by Ethereum where it went up, because I did convert a little bit of Bitcoin to ETH as a hedge in case ETH doesn't go home, because ETH Bitcoin went to the target range. Now, I don't know how low it's going to go. It just put in a new low. I have said before that my worst case scenario is around 0.03. Now, it doesn't have to go all the way that low, but the reason was because if you view this as sort of a bubble where it formed, you can see this was all sort of structural, slowly moving up, and then here's where the bubble started, right here. So it's always possible that ETH Bitcoin returns to where that bubble started. That's always a possibility. I don't think it has to go that low. I'm just saying that that's what I considered to be the worst case scenario, was 0.03. So there is still a chance that it does go lower. Some evidence that points to lower would be that QT is still going on, and with ETH Bitcoin putting in new lows after the most recent rate cut, it suggests perhaps that the neutral rate is still below the current Fed funds rate. So there's that to consider. Because remember, last cycle, ETH Bitcoin bottomed, around the second rate cut, and it corresponded to about 50 basis points rate cut. So far, we've had 75 basis points of rate cuts, but ETH Bitcoin keeps putting in new lows. The counterpoint to remember is that last cycle, when ETH Bitcoin bottomed after around 50 basis points of rate cuts, the terminal rate back then was 250, right? So that was about 1/5. This time we've had 75, but the terminal rate has been 550, right? So that's less than 1/5. So I think that's sort of the counterpunch, and you might need another rate cut or two to get it to the level where it's really going to bottom out, or maybe you just need quantitative easing. So then, first of all, we'll talk about the seemingly less and less likely scenario of it going home. But before we talk about that, let's try to view the market in a different way. Another way to view it, of course, is to just connect the lows that we've been following and view it as, a parallel channel. Say, all right, well, ETH has it's been in this parallel channel for a while, and now it's back at this midpoint. Now, of course, if you're a critic, you'll say, well, this entire uptrend Ben's missed out on. And I'm like, not really, because I was in Bitcoin and it completely outperformed ETH. So I don't really care. But if you value your portfolio in US dollars, then yes, I have. If you value it in Bitcoin, I haven't. Here's the channel. So if Bitcoin's cyclical view continues to prevail, which it has been, right? If you look at Bitcoin in 2024 compared to 2020 and 2016 and 2012, you can see that normally Bitcoin goes up in Q4 of halving years. And if you throw on the average of 2012, 2016, and 2020, you'll see, in fact, that Bitcoin right now is basically at its average of all prior halving years. And if it continues, you can see that it would allow Bitcoin to go higher into the end of the year if it follows the cyclical view. And I have said back in, a few weeks ago, when the unemployment rate came in at 4.1%, I said it makes sense to defer to the cyclical view. I gave out my cases as clear as I could. I said if the unemployment rate comes in hot at like 4.3 or 4.4, then the monetary policy view will likely prevail. But if it comes in low at like 4 or 4.1, as long as it's not going up, then the cyclical view will likely prevail. And it has, right? If you go look at the ROI from the low for Bitcoin, it's right where it always is at this point in the cycle. This is where it normally is. So what's the big deal, right? So it's following the cyclical view. So if Bitcoin continues to follow the cyclical view, right? If it follows it for the next 2 months, which I don't know if it will, but let's suppose that it does. If you go look at Bitcoin USD and you look at sort of the last two sort of rallies in the halving years, in Q4 of the halving years, let's switch this over to a log scale. what you'll notice is that there was a correction in January of 2021, and then there was this correction over here in January of 2017. Okay? So if Bitcoin rallies into mid-January, then it's hard to imagine that ETH doesn't get lifted up with it, right? So in that scenario, if Bitcoin does rally, then it would likely lift ETH up with it and potentially take it as high as the top of this channel, which would be, around or slightly above the prior all-time highs. That's if Bitcoin continues to follow the cyclical view, which it has been following. The only evidence to suggest that there's any merit to any other outcome, because again, the cyclical view remains strong. And I mean, it just seems like the markets, following the election results, following the rate cuts, following just sort of all this promise for something new, it seems like the markets are rallying because of that. Similar thing they did after Reagan was elected in a landslide in 1980. The markets rallied for a little bit. And then eventually they had to face sort of the realities of the economy at the time, because there was high inflation back then too. So, looking at this today, I assume that this would be the case, right? If Bitcoin, right? It's investing is a bunch of if-then statements. And for me, just to be clear, I've already started hedging with ETH. So any downside I present from here on out for ETH is more so me acknowledging what my downside risk is. It's not me convincing myself why I shouldn't own ETH. It's me just saying, all right, well, this is my downside risk if it plays out like that. So in this case, with ETH, if Bitcoin follows the cyclical view, which until proven otherwise is probably the base case assumption, then ETH could eventually rally above this trend line. It is possible that it just does something like what it did over here, where it just kind of gets stuck around that midpoint. And then if it does that, then by, say, mid-January, it would be around 4K. Right? It'd be around 4K by mid-January, if it just sort of gets stuck around this midpoint, kind of like what happened back over here in April of 2023. So that is an outcome. That is a potential outcome where it just sort of gets stuck there. And it slowly just defies going home and says, to hell with Ben's view, right? He doesn't know what he's talking about. Maybe he got ETH Bitcoin right, but he's wrong about ETH USD. I'm already hedging against me being wrong about it going home. I think it makes sense to at this point. Maybe the only way it goes home is if, if I'm involved in it, right? But in this case, with Bitcoin, right? What is the case? What is the case that it could go against any other outcome, right? Is there a case at this point? The answer is likely not, but there are snippets of information that if the market were to throw us a curveball, we could look back and say, all right, okay, it makes sense. Like, that's what happened. One of which, of course, is USDT dominance. So if you go look at USDT dominance, one of the things you'll notice is that it's basically at its long-term trend line. So we used this trend line back in March of 2024 to identify Bitcoin's mid-cycle top at 73K. It also corresponded to the time that gold broke out, right? We said this is likely the mid-cycle top. What's funny is now I have everyone messaging me about this. They're like, "Man, did you know that USDT dominance is at its lower trend line again? Does that mean this is another top for Bitcoin?" First of all, the answer is I don't know. Second of all, I do expect this trend line to eventually break. It can't go up forever, right? It can't hold forever because this is a percentage. So if it holds forever, the implication is that USDT dominance would eventually go above 100%, which does not make sense. It does not make sense to think about it like that. So yes, USDT dominance held as support in March, and there is a chance it holds as support again. And if there is, it would imply there's a larger correction in the market. That is basically the only piece of evidence, real evidence, on the crypto charts, I think, that you can find to suggest that maybe the cyclical view doesn't play out. But it seems like a Hail Mary. It seems like a Hail Mary that something like that's going to happen. I mean, it just seems like Bitcoin has the momentum. So why fade the momentum until the markets give us a reason to fade it, right? As long as Bitcoin's trending up, don't fade momentum, right? And this is the issue, is that, people will call for tops constantly, and it's easy to, like, sort of throw my hand in the ring and be like, all right, well, the extension of the 20-week moving average has reached the point where normally it would imply there's going to be a pullback. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, if you were to go look at the natural price of the 20-week moving, or the natural log of the price of the 20-week moving average, you can see that every time Bitcoin gets somewhat heated above the 20-week moving average, it tends to cool off. And the level of which it gets above its 20-week moving average tends to diminish from one cycle to another. And so I said in a live stream a few days ago that 93K could be a potential pullback. But that doesn't mean that it can't break through. In the same way, this trend line also has to eventually break, because if it doesn't, then the implication would be that Bitcoin eventually only ever goes below its 20-week moving average and stays below it permanently, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. So it's easy to sort of throw your hand in the ring and say, all right, this could be a pullback. But the reality is that when Bitcoin is moving, it is dangerous to fade it. It is. The USDT dominance chart, this is something that happened last cycle too, is essentially you had this 2019 tag when gold broke out. That marked the mid-cycle top. And then it came back down and more or less tagged the trend line in February of 2020, which was the breakout, right? That was the breakout by Bitcoin right here. Similar thing, right? I mean, we've been following this forever. And I said back in March it would take about 6 to 9 months to break out. And it did, right? It took about 7 to 8 months. So what happened in February of 2020 is we got a recession, right? We got a recession. And it basically just happened like that overnight, right? The unemployment rate shot up to 10% practically overnight. And the market sold off. And it came back down to this trend line over here, at least on the weekly close. So if Ethereum is to go home this year, it would have to be because the market throws us a curveball. But I can't, as an investor, I can't go into this saying that has to happen. I recognize there is a chance that it does. And if you look, frankly, if you look at the yield curve, no one can predict when recessions are going to start, including and especially me. But if you look at the yield curve, if you look at the spread on the 10-year and the 3-month, it's at only 10 basis points. Right? It's close to uninverting, and these green shaded regions are where those recessions have previously occurred, right? They usually occur upon uninversion of the 3-month or the 10-year yield. Sometimes they occur as it's happening, sometimes it's a few months later. We don't know. Right? So it's not like it's impossible. Remember, recessions are not predicted by the masses. They happen when no one is expecting them to happen. They don't happen when everyone's like, oh yeah, recession now. Right? And that's why I said back in 2022 that recessions don't occur when yield curves become inverted. They occur, if they're going to occur, they occur after the uninversion of the yield curve. Not the inversion, it's the uninversion where it happens, if it's going to. There are times when the yield curve has inverted and then uninverted, and there was no recession. 1967 is an example, right? It inverted here and then uninverted, no recession. And then 1995, I believe, you had or was it 1999? You had it was one of these times, I think, it was in sometime in the mid-90s, I think, there was sort of like a brief inversion and you didn't immediately get a recession. Oh, it was 1998. I think it was 1998. 1998, there was a recession, but it was 2 years later, right? Just like 1967, there was a recession, it was 2 years later. But for an investor, 2 years is a long time, right? That's a long time to just sit and not do anything. That's why I say for crypto, during times of uncertainty, the best thing to do to get exposure is just to sit in Bitcoin. It gives you exposure to the upside, and it minimizes your downside risk, right? So if Bitcoin wants to go north of 100K, great, you own Bitcoin. If Bitcoin crashes in some unforeseen recession, well, hey, at least you didn't own those altcoins, right? Because they're going to probably crash worse. Well, some of them might not, but at least the relics will probably crash worse. The non-relics might actually not crash as much because they already got decimated in the Bitcoin dominance uptrend. So yes, like there is a chance here. It's not like it's completely out of the, it's not like it's completely out of the question. We are witnessing this process play out. So I don't want to sit here and say that it can't happen. because it always could. And the reality is that if it does happen, it's probably going to happen when no one is expecting it to happen, including myself. Um, but at the same time, I can't sit here and keep calling for it forever. The reason I've been comfortable calling for it up to this point was because I was confident that Bitcoin dominance would go up and that ETH Bitcoin would keep going down. But we're so close to, I feel like, the climax of that narrative that it makes sense to hedge my view with ETH now, whereas a year ago it didn't. And 2 years ago it didn't because Bitcoin kept outperforming. But now it starts to make sense. That doesn't mean that ETH has bottomed against Bitcoin. It could still go lower, but I do think it makes sense to start that sort of that hedging process. Now, as far as ETH USD, you might wonder, and I'm getting, this is getting pretty far out there. In terms of sort of assigning a narrative to what caused these drops by ETH in April and August. And the reality is, I don't know. It doesn't have to be anything because it also dropped in April and August of 2016, and I'm sure you could find a narrative for it then. But if you were to ask me, Ben, find a reason for why ETH dropped in April and in August, and then tell me if there's a reason that it might drop again within the next, say, 2 to 3 months, I would probably point to the carry trade, right? The Japanese yen. That might sound like it's coming completely out of left field, and it sort of is, but just to show you what I mean, if you were to look at Japan interest rates, which is not something we spend a lot of time talking about, but if you look at interest rates in Japan, they had 2 hikes this year. One was in March, the other one was in July. When did ETH USD have those drops? When did the drops occur by ETH? April and August. So the drops by ETH occurred 1 month after the Bank of Japan raised rates. 1 month, right? They raised in March, ETH dropped in April. They raised in July, ETH dropped in August. Right? So you might wonder, like, why does this matter? Like, why does Japanese interest rates, why does the Bank of Japan interest rates matter? Well, a lot of people actually will borrow money because if interest rates in Japan are only, 0.25%, a lot of people will use that rather than, say, rates here, because money is cheaper over there than it is here. So when the Bank of Japan raises rates, the carry trade gets unwound. The people that are using it to then buy up risk assets, that carry trade starts to get unwound. And that's what leads to the sort of the devaluation of some of the risk assets. So I think that's what you could argue, is that the Bank of Japan raised rates, and then it led to some degree the unwind of the carry trade. Now, will they raise rates again? Probably. The reason why they probably will is because if you look at the yen against the dollar, the reason they raise rates a lot of the times, right? The reason they raise rates is because the yen is getting devalued. Okay, so overlay Japanese interest rates. This is an Ethereum video, and I'm somehow talking about monetary policy in Japan. But if you overlay, welcome to Copetown, population me, right? If you look at Japan, you can see that as the yen was being devalued, they raised rates. And then here, it was being devalued. It was still being devalued, right? There was a sort of a brief reprieve in terms of that anticipation of that hike. And then they raised rates again, and then the yen caught a bid against the dollar. But now it's starting to move down again. And it's probably going to keep moving down. And the dollar is probably going to keep moving up. Remember, I said the dollar is likely going to go up through the end of the year. Through the end of the year or early next year. The dollar did the same exact thing in 2016, right? The dollar rallied in 2016. So if you go look at DXY, we've talked a lot about this, right? I've said it'll rally after the rate cut, and it sure as hell has. I mean, it bottomed down here at around 100, and now it's all the way up to 106.6. The same thing happened in Q4 of 2016, right? I mean, the dollar rallied and Bitcoin rallied with it. That's why I'm saying it probably makes sense to just defer to the cyclical view of Bitcoin, because everything seems the same. The only thing that's different today than 2016 is the, you know, sort of the inverted yield curve, right? That's the only main difference. Is you have an inverted yield curve today that's uninverting. Back then you didn't. So it's possible it plays out differently, but why fade the momentum unless the market gives you a reason to do so? Maybe that reason will come in December when the labor market data comes out, but that's still several weeks away, right? So why worry about what's going to happen weeks from now today? So when you look at the yen, and you're looking at sort of the drop by the yen again, it raises the question, well, will the Bank of Japan raise rates again following the unwind of the carry trade? And I don't know, but, you know, if you go read some of the articles about it, some of the opposition lawmakers, you know, came out today and said that they should raise rates to 1% to reverse the weak yen. That would mean another 75 basis points. Here's another article. Analysts are saying they either need to do a rate hike in December or January. December or January. Here's another article. Seems like it's struggling to load. Yeah, Bank of Japan policymaker calls for very moderate pace of rate hikes, and this was, you know, this was back in October. So look, I mean, they're probably going to raise rates. Do they raise rates in December? The next meeting. Here's something really, really interesting, and I don't know if it's really actually interesting, is that the next meeting by the Fed is basically the same as the next meeting by the Bank of Japan, which is actually, it's kind of fascinating, because the reason why it's interesting is if you look at U.S. interest rates and you subtract out, this might seem crazy, but just follow me for a minute. If you subtract out Japan interest rates, you get a really interesting chart, actually. So that's why the carry trade gets unwound so much, or why it did back in August, is because the market was all of a sudden pricing in all these rate cuts by the Fed and all these rate hikes by the Bank of Japan. So if you look at U.S. interest rates minus interest rates in Japan, you get this chart. My laptop is going very, very, very slow right now. I don't, you know, I probably should go buy a new one. I really don't know why I don't. I mean, I've been having issues with this laptop for like a year now, and I'm just so stubborn. I'm trying to get this thing to update, but it's going really slow. Yeah, I mean, here you can kind of see, like, if you look at the at the Fed, the balance sheet, or sorry, the interest rates over in the United States at the Fed, and then you subtract out the Bank of Japan, right? I mean, that's normally when there can be times of economic uncertainty. It doesn't always happen, right? I mean, like, you can look in 1984 and see that everything was fine. You can look at 1989 and see that everything was fine until a year later, right? It took a while. And so this didn't really start dropping until April. And the reason it dropped in April was because that was when the Bank of Japan raised rates for the first time in in basically a very, very long time. So I guess this is sort of the argument. Like, if the Fed lowers rates at the December meeting, right? If the Fed lowers rates at the December meeting to 4.5%, which does seem like the most likely outcome, and the Bank of Japan raises rates at the December meeting, let's say they raise rates 25 basis points, that's 50 basis points that starts to get unwound. And then also, of course, it'll depend on sort of the language they use, right? Are they going to continue hiking? Is the Fed going to continue cutting? That might also have something to do with it. There's also a chance they won't raise rates until January, right? And so, I've always thought that ETH would make this move in December, but there's a chance that it won't happen until January. Because remember, when the Bank of Japan raised rates, ETH didn't have a capitulation that month. It was the following month. It wasn't the month. that the Bank of Japan raised rates. It was the following month where ETH USD had that final capitulation. So if they cut, or if the Bank of Japan raises in January or in December, that doesn't mean that ETH USD has to drop then. I mean, if Bitcoin's still going up, ETH's probably going to go with it. That's why I think that it makes sense to own ETH, because there's only this outcome that allows it to ever go home, but it might not happen. And if it does get a drop in January, or let's say the Bank of Japan raises rates in January, then maybe ETH drops in February. But there's a chance that whenever that drop occurs, it could be to a price that's higher than the price today, rather than actually going home. So for me, at this point, when I think about, what do I do as it relates to an asset like Ethereum, I think it makes sense to start hedging with it, because I don't know if it's ever going to go home or not. Like, as much as I wanted it to, and as much as I thought that it would, my patience is being tested, you know? And I feel like I had the ability to be patient because ETH Bitcoin was in the process of collapsing. And you could argue that I should continue on with my patience since ETH Bitcoin is still in the process of dropping. It just put in a new low today. But I also think that we're getting pretty close to the end of the downtrend for ETH Bitcoin. And I don't want to push my luck. So the way I see it, rather than being, 100% Bitcoin or 99% Bitcoin, I think it makes sense to start hedging, especially as we get closer and closer to 2025. If somehow Bitcoin detours from normal seasonality, then it's possible it could happen this year. But Bitcoin has not yet given us any reason to believe that is the outcome, other than the USDT dominance trend line, which I've said before, it's going to break at some point, and maybe it'll just break now. So that's where I am with Ethereum. From a risk-adjusted returns perspective, ETH starts to make sense the closer we get to 2025. That doesn't mean ETH can't drop. And in fact, it would be interesting if the Bank of Japan raised rates in December, and if ETH did have a drop in January, and everyone thought it was the end, and then that was just 1 year, before, the January 2025, or January 2026. Remember, the cyclical view of ETH was that it did drop in December of 2016, but then it hit an all-time high. It hit cycle all-time high in January of 2018. So I could see an outcome like that, but I do think that in a year, it's probably not going to matter. And so if it doesn't matter in a year, it probably shouldn't matter today. And if that's the case, I think it makes sense to start hedging with Ethereum. And if it goes home in the next 2 to 3 months, then so be it. I will be happy because I can finally put it behind me. And if it doesn't go home, then it's just another blemish on the track record. And that's all it is. If you guys like the content, make sure one more thing. If you look at year-to-date ROI, year-to-date ROI let's start with ETH. So here's 2016 and 2019, and then here's 2024. So see, 2024 is doing something different than it did in 2019 and 2016, right? So that is what is throwing me off. That's what's throwing me off, is because 2016, 2019, ETH was going down, but now it's going up. If we look at it like this, just with 2016 and 2019, maybe it doesn't look like it can't happen. I mean, I guess if ETH just drops back down here, then maybe it still could happen. But you got to start hedging at some point. And then if you look at ETH Bitcoin in 2024, you know what it looks like still? 2019, where it just kind of bled all the way down into the end of the year. It bottomed in September, but that's also when QT ended. QT hasn't ended yet, and so maybe that's the reason why it just keeps on bleeding. We'll go ahead and wrap it up. Hopefully that video was useful in terms of trying to get you to understand like what I see with Ethereum. What is the main risk? I think the main risk for Ethereum right now is just sort of competing monetary policy plans in the East and the West. That's what's arguably led to the August and April capitulations and could theoretically lead to one more. But I don't want people to sort of miss out on ETH USD because they were just stuck waiting for it to go home. It made sense before to ignore ETH because ETH Bitcoin was in a downtrend, and it likely still is. But as we get close to 2025, it makes sense to, I think, be hedged and realize that ETH could go up, especially on its Bitcoin pair in 2025. And if you value your portfolio in Satoshis, then the Bitcoin pair is actually the only thing that matters. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Links in the description below. You can lock in a low rate. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.